The call light above room 7 clicked on at 3 a.m., same as it had the 3 nights before. I set down my coffee and walked the hall, already running through the list of things it would be. Mrs. Calloway asking for water, or maybe she'd tangled herself in the blood pressure cuff again. But Mrs. Calloway had been discharged 2 days ago. Room 7 was empty. I stood in the doorway and reached for the light switch. The bed was made clean, the chair pushed in, the call button resting on the pillow exactly where housekeeping always left it. I walked over and checked the cord. It was plugged in. I unplugged it, looped it neatly, and set it on the bedside table. I mentioned it to Carol, the charge nurse who came on at 6. She listened with her coat half on, keys already in her hand, and said the electrical in this wing was old. She said it without looking at me. I asked one of the orderlies about it, a man named Dennis who had worked there since the building was a county facility. He said room 7 had always been a little funny. I asked him what that meant. He said the woman who used to have that bed years back, she was a regular. Came in every winter, same complaint, stayed a few weeks, went home. One year she just stopped coming. He said the town had a way of doing that with certain people, just sort of absorbing them back in. He smiled like that was a comfortable thought. The next night I came in for my shift and the call light above room 7 was already on, glowing amber in the empty hallway before I had even reached the floor. I had not clocked in yet, our next story. My flashlight caught the same muddy boot print on the 4th floor twice. I noticed it the first time around 11, just outside the stairwell door, a clear left boot, deep tread, someone who had come up from outside. I figured a maintenance guy had been through earlier and moved on. But when I came back around at midnight, the print was still there, same door, same position, and it was wet. I touched it. The mud was fresh. I took the stairs down, checked the lobby doors, checked the badge log on the panel behind my desk. Nothing. No entries after 8. The building had been sealed for hours. I told the guy who relieved me in the morning, a local named Darren who had worked this building for 11 years. He went quiet in a way that was not the quiet of someone thinking. He handed me my sign-out sheet and said the heating on 3 sometimes made the floors expand, could look like impressions. I told him it was mud. He nodded and looked at the window. I asked the woman at the diner across the street about the building, just making conversation over coffee, and she refilled my cup without looking at me and said it was a good building, good employer, and changed the subject to the weather forecast. I went back through 6 months of my own incident logs that night. The 4th floor stairwell door appeared in my notes 9 times, always framed the same way. Check door, secure, check door, secure. I never wrote that, I never used that phrasing, I always write clear or locked. 9 entries, 9 times in my handwriting, words I did not write, our next story. I passed the grain elevator 3 times before I realized the road was wrong. Not wrong in an obvious way. The pavement was cracked in the same places. The Carver feed sign had the same burned out second R, but I was walking east toward the apartments and the elevator is north of town, nowhere near my route. I stopped and checked my phone. The GPS pin showed me exactly where I should have been, a block and a half from home, right on Oak. A man was sitting on the low concrete wall outside the elevator doors. He was maybe 60, work jacket, hands folded in his lap, and he was watching me without any particular expression. I did that thing where you give a polite nod and look away fast, because it was almost midnight and I had flour from the diner on my apron, and I did not feel like explaining anything to a stranger. I walked. The Carver sign was behind me, and then after maybe 40 steps, it was in front of me again. I turned around. The man on the wall had not moved. He raised one hand, not a wave exactly, more like he was stopping traffic. I went into the gas station on the corner, the one that stays open all night, and I told the kid at the register what was happening, partly as a joke, partly not. He looked at the window and then back at the counter and said very quietly that I should stay inside until the man was gone and that some roads closed at night and it was better not to ask why. I waited 40 minutes. When I finally walked home, I took a different street and made it in 5. I still do not know which street I took, our next story. The coffee machine at the Millhaven rest stop took my dollar and gave me nothing, so I was standing there hitting the coin return when the woman in the parking lot caught my eye. She was walking slow circuits around my rig, not close enough to touch it, just circling, looking up at the cab. I stepped outside and asked if she needed help. She stopped, smiled politely, and said she was waiting for her husband. Then she went back to circling. I went inside and asked the attendant about her. He was maybe 60, reading a paperback, and he did not look up. He said the rest stop closed to pedestrians at 10. I told him there was a woman outside right now. He turned a page and said that happened sometimes. I asked what that meant. He said some people just liked the trucks. I went back out to check on her and she was gone. My logbook was sitting on the hood of my cab, open to today's page. I keep it locked in the cab, I know I do. I drove the first 100 yards toward the highway and stopped. The rest stop lights were still on behind me, and in my passenger mirror I could see the woman standing exactly where my rig had been parked, still looking up at nothing, still circling something that was not there anymore. I called a buddy who runs the same route and told him what happened. He went quiet for a long time. Then he said Millhaven was the third stop she had been seen at this year, and that the first trucker who reported her had gone missing on Route 9 about 40 miles east, and that his rig was found idling on the shoulder with the logbook open on the hood. Our next story. I pulled the last strip of wallpaper off the dining room and found a name written underneath. Not scratched or carved, just written in pencil in careful block letters, maybe 6 inches tall. Harold Prout. Below it a date from 1962, and below that a second date, 1963, 11 months later. I figured it was some old owner marking the year he put the paper up. Reasonable enough. I kept working. When I went into town for more joint compound, I mentioned it to the woman at the hardware counter, more as conversation than anything else. She asked which house. I told her the address on Route 9, the old Prout place. She handed me my change and turned to restock a shelf that did not need restocking. The man behind me in line stepped back slightly, like I had moved toward him. I drove home and thought about that, the way she turned, the way he stepped. That night I pulled up the county records online and found Harold Prout, deed transfer dated October 1963. He had sold the house and left the county. No forwarding record, which was common enough for that era. Nothing alarming. But the wallpaper I had pulled down that afternoon was old, certainly old, but it was not 1962 old. The paste, the pattern, the way it came off in long, clean sheets, I had renovated enough houses to know. That paper went up in the 80s at the earliest. Someone had papered over that name and left it there. Someone had come back to that wall years after Harold Prout was gone and decided it needed to be covered. I have 3 more rooms to strip, our next story. Room 11 had been checked out since Tuesday, so when I saw the bathroom light on through the curtain gap, I figured a bulb had just stuck on somehow. That is what I told myself. I wrote the date on a sticky note, added it to my clipboard, and went back to sorting the key cards. An hour passed. The light was still on. I walked over with the master key, knocked twice the way you are supposed to, then let myself in. The room smelled like cedar and something underneath that, something wet. The bathroom light was off. The bed was untouched except for one small dent in the pillow, the kind a person leaves when they have been sitting and thinking for a while. I mentioned it to Carol when she came in at 6. She looked at the room number on my clipboard and then looked at me, and she asked me how long I had worked there. 7 months, I told her. She nodded and took the clipboard and crossed out my note like it was a math error. I asked the guy at the hardware store, just making conversation, whether anything had ever happened at the motel. He started to answer and then found something urgent to do behind the counter. I asked the woman who runs the diner. She refilled my coffee and talked about the weather for 4 minutes straight without pausing once. The thing is, I went back and checked the motel registry out of curiosity. It only goes back to 1987, a place that old should have records going further than that, and every staff member would know it. But what settled in my stomach and stayed there was simpler than all of that. The pillow dent was warm, our next story. The GPS rerouted me on Adela Road for the 3rd time that week, and I still had not found the house it was looking for. The address was 4410 Deller, a package for someone named R. Koch, and every time I drove the full length of that road I counted the same sequence. 4406, then 4408, then 4414. The lot between them was just a concrete pad with a rusted basketball hoop and some knee-high grass. No mailbox, no house number painted on the curb. I flagged it as undeliverable twice. Both times the package came back to me the next morning with a sticky note that said reattempt, like someone had pulled it from the return bin before it was even logged. The 3rd night I stopped at the Sunoco on Route 9 and asked the woman at the counter if she knew the address. She was maybe 60, reading glasses pushed up on her head. I showed her the label on my phone. She looked at it for a long moment, then handed the phone back without touching the screen, using just the very tips of her fingers on the edge of the case. She said there used to be a family there, said it the way you say something to close a door. I asked what happened to them. She started wiping down the counter with a rag, slow circles, and she said she really could not say. On my way back out to the truck, I glanced at the package on the passenger seat. I had looked at that label a dozen times, the address, the name, the delivery instructions. I had not noticed until that moment that the return address was also 4410 Deller Road, our next story. The mop bucket wheel had a squeak I knew like my own heartbeat, so when it stopped echoing back to me in the east hallway, I noticed. I stood still for a second. The hallway stretched back toward the gymnasium, all that pale tile under the emergency lights, and it was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. I told myself the acoustics were different near the trophy cases. Old buildings do things like that. I kept mopping. The trophy cases ran along the left wall, class photos going back to 1962. I had passed them 100 nights without looking, but something made me stop at the 1978 row. Third kid from the left in the sophomore photo was a boy with dark hair and a gap between his front teeth. Below his picture, someone had written his name in pencil, directly on the glass from the inside. Not a name I recognized, not a name from the printed label. I asked the day janitor about it the next morning. He looked at the case for a long time and then said the east hallway flooded some years back and the photos had all been replaced. I asked him why someone would write a name on the inside of the glass. He picked up his keys and told me the east hallway floods because the drainage out there has never been right and the district just lives with it. That was all he said. I went back that night and stood in front of the case again. The pencil name was still there. The boy in the photo was still third from the left, but the gap in his teeth was gone, and I was almost certain the photo was facing a slightly different direction, the way a person turns when they hear someone coming down the hall. Our next story. The baby monitor on the kitchen counter showed both kids sleeping, so I started washing the dishes just to have something to do. The Hargrove house was quiet the way old houses get quiet, settling and clicking, and I had maybe 2 hours before the parents came home. That was when I noticed the framed photo above the sink. It was a school picture, a boy maybe 8 or 9, gap-toothed, wearing a red striped shirt. Nothing strange about it except that the Hargroves only had 2 daughters, both asleep upstairs, and I had been in this kitchen a dozen times and never once seen that photo. I told myself they were watching a nephew or something. I told myself I had simply never looked at that wall. I dried my hands and went to check on the girls. They were fine, tangled in their blankets, the nightlight doing its slow color rotation. On the way back downstairs, I passed the hallway shelf, the one with the ceramic owl and the stack of library books, and there was a second photo there. Same boy. Different year older maybe, but the same gap and the same striped shirt like he wore it every picture day. I texted Mrs. Hargrove something like, "Cute photo of the boy in the kitchen, whose kid is that?" I kept it casual. She read it. I could see the 2 check marks go dark. She never replied. When they came home around 11, Mr. Hargrove walked straight to the kitchen and turned the frame face down without saying a word. Mrs. Hargrove paid me in cash, thanked me, and held the door. I have sat for 3 families on Culver Street since then, and every single one of them has that same photo somewhere in the house. Our next story. The plow had not come through Arden Street in 3 days, and I had memorized every window of the house across the road. The Pelletier house, according to my neighbor Karen, had been empty since October. So on the second afternoon of the storm, I was not sure what to make of the figure standing at the upstairs window. I assumed it was a reflection, the way snow and glass can trick you. I went back to my book. That evening the light in the downstairs front room came on. A single lamp, warm yellow, the kind that looks lived in. I watched it for 20 minutes and told myself someone had left it on a timer. Probably the family checking in remotely, making sure pipes were not freezing. That made sense. I made dinner and did not look out the window again. The third morning I saw the front door standing open. Not swinging, not ajar, wide open, a black rectangle in all that white. The snow had drifted over the threshold and no footprints came or went in any direction. I called Karen. She went quiet in a way that felt practiced, like she had closed a door behind a thought she did not want me to follow. She said the Pelletiers moved to Phoenix and good riddance. I asked about the open door and she said the cold was playing tricks and I should stay away from that window. I started to ask how she knew which window I meant. She had already hung up. I have been watching the door since noon. The lamp is back on now, and a second one deeper in the house, in a room I cannot quite see into. The snow is not letting up until Thursday. Our next story. The pump farthest from the lights, number 6, clicked on at 2:17 in the morning without a car anywhere near it. I watched the numbers on the display start rolling, slow and even, like someone was filling up. I figured it was a glitch. We had glitches. The electrical in that building was older than me, and Earl had been saying he would fix it for 2 years. I logged it in the notebook and went back to my coffee. It happened again at 2:17 the next night and the night after that. I mentioned it to Earl when he came in at 6. He looked at the notebook, looked at me, and told me to stop logging it. Just a calibration error, he said, and he walked to his office and closed the door. I had worked there 9 months. He had never closed that door before. A regular named Dwight came in around 3 the following week, a guy who had lived in Patton Creek his whole life. I asked him, casual as I could, if anything had ever happened out at Pump 6. He set his coffee cup down on the counter and he did not pick it back up. He said there were things in this town that stayed in this town and that I should appreciate the job Earl gave me. Then he left without his coffee and without his change. I started paying attention to the dates after that. I pulled up old weather records on my phone, the way you do when a thing will not leave you alone. February 19th, the same date every year going back as far as the local paper had digital archives. The last entry I found was a small one, 2 paragraphs, no photograph, and it listed 5 names. Earl was one of them, our next story. My aunt's neighbor brought over a casserole the first evening, set it on the counter, and said almost nothing except that the house had good bones. I thanked her. She was already turning away before I finished the sentence. I found the calendar on the 3rd day, still hanging in the kitchen doorway where my aunt had left it. She had been crossing off dates the way some people do, 1 Kleenex per day, and she had kept that habit right up until the week she died, but there were 4 extra dates crossed off after that. 4 days she could not have marked herself. I asked the woman at the hardware store about it, just casually, while I was buying boxes. She handed me my change and said she was sure there was a simple explanation for whatever I was asking about. I had not finished asking. The postmaster was friendlier but said almost the same thing, word for word, a simple explanation. He said it while looking just past my shoulder. I went back to the house and looked at the calendar again. The excess after her death were slightly different from the earlier ones, pressed harder into the paper, made by someone with a heavier hand. There were 4 of them, 1 for each Thursday between when she died and when I arrived. I checked my aunt's address book that night, looking for anyone I might have missed, any name I did not recognize. There was 1 page torn out near the back. The edges were clean, like it had been removed carefully, not in a hurry. Her spare key was kept under the blue pot on the porch. When I moved the pot to sweep, the key was already gone. Our next story. The woman who hired me left a handwritten list of instructions on the kitchen counter, and number 7 said, "Do not answer the landline." No explanation, just that in careful looping cursive. I figured it was telemarketers. I figured a lot of things that first week. The house sat at the edge of Creel, population maybe 800, and I had taken the job because it paid well and I needed quiet. The owners were in Portugal. I had a key, a list, and a freezer full of labeled meals. The landline was a beige wall unit near the back door, and for 6 days it never made a sound. On the 7th night it rang. I let it go, counted 12 rings, it stopped. When I walked to the gas station the next morning for coffee, I mentioned it to the man behind the counter, said something like, "Strange, all those rings." He slid my change across without looking up, and I noticed his jaw had gone tight. I asked if the family got a lot of calls. He said they were good people, and that was the whole sentence. A woman filling a cup at the self-serve station turned her back to me. That night the phone rang again, same count, and I stood close enough to feel the plastic vibrating under each ring. When it stopped, I noticed the notepad beside it, the one people keep near phones for messages. The top sheet had been torn off, but the impression of old handwriting was still pressed into the page below. I angled it toward the light from the window. It was a list of dates. The most recent one was last Tuesday. Next to it, in the same careful looping cursive from the instructions, was my name, our next story. Smoke was rising from the campsite across the lake when I woke up at 4 in the morning, not just embers. A full, deliberate fire, orange and steady, with a person sitting beside it facing my direction. I watched from inside my tent for a while. I told myself it was another camper, which was fine, that was allowed. The trailhead sign had said dispersed camping was permitted throughout the watershed. I was not alone out here, and that was not a problem. I made coffee on my little stove and watched the fire across the lake burn down to nothing by 6. The person was gone before full light came in. When I packed up and hiked the 4 miles back to the trailhead that afternoon, I stopped at the ranger station to fill out my exit card. There was a woman behind the counter, maybe 60, with the particular stillness of someone who has worked a quiet job for decades. I mentioned the campsite across the lake, just making conversation, said it looked like someone had a nice fire going in the middle of the night. She wrote something on a paper in front of her and did not look up. I said the lake name, Cutler Lake, to make sure she understood which one I meant. She looked up then. She said there was no maintained access to the far side of Cutler Lake, no trail, and that the terrain made it effectively unreachable. She said this the way you would explain something to a child. I thanked her and walked back to my car. I had left no note anywhere. I had told no one where I was camping. I had not posted anything online before the trip. The figure across the lake had been facing my tent specifically. Our next story. Somebody had already signed the logbook when I arrived for my shift. I do the fire lookout rotation at Burrell Peak, third Saturday of every month, same as I have for 2 years. I drove up the access road at 6 in the morning, unlocked the tower door myself, and the logbook was sitting open on the desk with a fresh entry. Same pen we keep in the drawer. Same handwriting column, but the name in the volunteer line was just a single letter H, and the time listed was 4:52 a.m. I asked the ranger station about it over the radio. The woman who answered, her name is Deb. She went quiet for a second before she said she would look into it. She never called back. I started asking around town the following week. I mentioned it at the diner to a man I recognized from the volunteer roster, a retired guy named Carl who does the summer shifts. He poured creamer into his coffee very slowly and said the logbook sometimes had clerical errors. That was the whole answer. He changed the subject to road conditions. I went back to the logbook and flipped through older entries. There were 7 other single-letter signatures, all H, spread across the last 4 years, all logged between midnight and 5 in the morning, always on dates when no volunteer was scheduled. I brought a photograph of the page to the ranger station in person. Deb looked at it for a long time. Then she said those shifts were covered by a local man who passed away. She said his name was Howard. She said he had loved that tower. She handed the photo back to me without touching it for very long. My last shift, I noticed the pen in the drawer was a different brand than the one we stock. Our next story. She was waiting at the corner of Route 9 and Millard, no house nearby, just a drainage ditch and a dead billboard for a hardware store that closed before I moved to the county. The app said her name was Donna. She got in without a word and I pulled back onto the highway. She asked me to take Old Fenwick Road instead of the main route. I told her the app had us on 9 and she said she knew, but to please take Fenwick. People have preferences. I turned. About 2 miles in, she said quietly that the town had been doing this a long time. I asked what town, meaning to be polite. She said Greer. That was the name of the unincorporated cluster we were passing through, 4 streets and a grain co-op. She said they had been keeping the road open for it, whatever it needed, for about 40 years. I glanced in the mirror. She was looking out the window at the fields. I asked her what she meant by that, and she said there had been a boy who went missing in 1987, out near the drainage canal, and nobody talked about it because the people who lived here understood that talking about it was an invitation. I laughed a little, nervous, the way you do. She told me to slow down. I did, and in the headlights I saw a reflective strip on a mailbox that read 412 Fenwick, which was her drop-off address. She thanked me, got out, and walked toward the dark house. No lights came on inside. I pulled away and checked the app to close the ride. The pickup had been logged at 412 Fenwick Road. Our next story. My bobber dipped and I set the hook on nothing, same as I had 4 times that hour. The lake around Cresser's Point is shallow and still, and on a clear Thursday in October you can hear everything: the frogs settling in, a car crossing the county bridge 2 miles off, your own breathing. So when the bell on Muller's Dock started ringing, I heard it clearly. Nobody keeps a bell on Muller's Dock. I have fished this lake for 11 years and I had never seen one there before. I told myself it was wind, except there was no wind. The surface was flat enough to read a map on, and I sat there watching the dock and listening to that bell ring in a slow, patient rhythm, like something marking time. I reeled in and paddled a little closer. The bell was a small brass thing tied to the dock post with orange cord. It was still moving, not swinging the way it would after a gust, but rotating in a tight circle, the way something rotates when a line has been pulled and released. I looked out at the water past the dock. There was a second boat out there, maybe 40 yards further in, with no light on it. I called out. My voice went flat and died, the way voices do over open water at night. The other boat did not move. I waited a long time and it did not move. I rode back to my truck. The gas station on Route 7 opens early, and the man who runs it grew up 2 houses from this lake. When I described the dock and the bell, he looked at me for a moment and then started wiping down the counter. He already knew which dock I meant. Our next story. My neighbor in 4B played the same 4 piano notes every night at 11, and I thought nothing of it for the first 2 weeks. 4 notes, low and slow, like someone working out the beginning of a song and never getting any further. I figured an elderly hobbyist, someone retired with too much quiet. The walls in the Renner building are thin enough that I could hear her kettle, her television, the particular creak of what I assumed was a rocking chair. Normal sounds. I cataloged them without meaning to, the way you do when you live alone. Then I asked Mrs. Pellard in the office which neighbor I shared that wall with, just to be friendly, maybe introduce myself. She stopped writing mid-sentence and looked up at me and said nobody had lived in 4B since the Gruber family moved out in 2019. She said it the way you say something that is not up for discussion. I went back upstairs and stood with my ear almost touching my own wall and waited. At 11 the notes came again. Exactly 4, same tempo, same key. I knocked twice and they stopped. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes before I knocked again. Nothing. I told myself old buildings settle, pipes conduct sound from other floors, acoustics do strange things. I believed it enough to sleep. I mentioned the piano to the man at the hardware store the next morning, just making conversation. He looked past me at the street outside and said the Grubers had a daughter who used to take lessons. Then he started talking about something else and did not stop talking about something else until I left. That was 4 months ago. The notes still come at 11. Last Tuesday they came at 3 in the afternoon, and I had a friend visiting, and she heard them too. She asked me whose coat was hanging by my door. Our next story. Every dispatcher in Holt County knows you do not log calls from the 4,400 block of Sutter Mill Road. Nobody told me that my first week. I found out the way you find out most things at a small station, by doing it wrong. A call came in around 2 in the morning, a woman's voice, very calm, asking if someone could check on her husband. I entered the address, started the incident report, and before I could finish typing, my supervisor Karen appeared behind me and put her hand flat on the keyboard. She said she would handle it. She took the headset, spoke 2 or 3 words I could not hear, and closed the call. Then she deleted my partial report without explanation. I asked about it the next morning. Karen said the woman at that address called sometimes and there was a note on file, a mental health situation, nothing for patrol to respond to. She smiled the way people smile when the conversation is over. I let it go for about 3 weeks. Then I pulled the call logs myself, going back as far as the system would let me, about 4 years. The 4,400 block of Sutter Mill Road appeared 11 times. Different shift supervisors. Every entry was closed inside 2 minutes, no unit dispatched, no follow-up code, just a single note in the remarks field that said the same thing each time, word for word. Resident accounted for, 11 calls, 11 identical remarks. I sat there looking at the screen thinking that was just a weird clerical habit, some template someone had used and others copied. Then I checked the property records. No residence has existed at that address since the structure fire in 2019, which, according to the county report, killed 1 woman and left her husband unaccounted for. Our next story. Benny stopped walking on the corner of Ash and Clement, which he never did. He was a good dog, a 7-year-old beagle with a predictable bladder and a predictable route, and every morning at 4:15 he trotted the same half-mile loop without argument. But that Tuesday he planted all 4 feet on the sidewalk and refused to pass the Greer property. I gave the leash a small tug. He sat down. The Greer house had been empty for about 2 years. The family moved without a sale, without a sign, without a word to anyone on the street as far as I could tell. My client, Mrs. Patton, had mentioned it once when she was paying me, and her voice had gone flat and careful, the way voices go when the subject is closed. I looked at the house. Porch light off, windows dark, the kind of dark that feels occupied, nothing unusual. I tried Benny again. He made a low sound, not quite a growl, and pressed himself against my shin. So I went around the block the long way, down Millard and back up Poplar, and I told myself the dog had smelled a possum or a gas leak or something reasonable. But on Poplar I passed old Gerald Fitch walking his shepherd the way he did every single morning, and when I mentioned Benny acting up near the Greer place, Gerald looked at me for a second without blinking. Then he said quietly to the sidewalk more than to me that the Greers had not moved. I waited for him to explain. He shortened his leash and kept walking, and he did not look back. I have 4 other clients on Ash Street, and none of them have ever mentioned the Greers either. Our next story. Every bed on the 3rd floor was empty except for Mr. Calloway in 312, and he had been asleep since 8. I was charting at the nurse's station when I noticed his door was open. I had closed it during my 9 o'clock check because he asked me to. I was sure of that. I walked down and pulled it shut again and stood there a moment listening to the hum of the fluorescent light over the supply closet, and then I went back to my desk. At 11:30 I looked up and the door was open again. I told myself the latch was faulty. Old building, old hardware. I went down, checked on Mr. Calloway, who was breathing slow and fine, and this time I watched the door click into the frame before I walked away. By midnight it was open again, and when I stepped into the room to close it, Mr. Calloway was awake. He was looking at the window, not at me. He said, without turning, that I should stop closing the door because they needed to be able to check on him. I asked him who he meant. He said the other nurses, the ones who came before my shift. He described them by their hair and their shoes, 2 women and a man, very specific. And when I told him gently that I was the only nurse on the floor, he turned and looked at me for a long moment. He said he had been a patient here 4 other times over 30 years and they were always here, and that the people in town knew about them, but nobody talked about it because the hospital had been there longer than the town had. I left his door open after that. When I came back at 2, he was gone, and the bed was cold. Our next story. 3rd floor, East Corridor, and the exit sign above stairwell B had burned out again. I made a note in the logbook and kept walking. Hargrove Municipal Building was not a place that attracted trouble. 4 floors of county records, a water authority office, a couple of permits desks, dead by 5, empty by 6. I had worked nights there for 2 years, and the strangest thing I had ever found was a raccoon in the break room on the 2nd floor. So when I heard typing, I stopped. It was coming from the assessor's office, suite 304. The door was closed, the light underneath it was off. I stood there for a moment, telling myself it was the building settling, pipes contracting, something mechanical. Then I heard it again, slow, deliberate keystrokes, one at a time, like someone reading while they typed. I knocked and opened the door, empty. The chairs were pushed in, the monitors dark, everything exactly as I had left it on my last round 40 minutes earlier. I mentioned it the next morning to the woman at the front desk, Carla, who had worked for the county for over 20 years. She looked at me the way people look at you when you have said something they were hoping never to come up again. Then she told me to put in a maintenance request if a light was out. I asked one of the custodians later. He shook his head and walked away without a word. I asked the permits clerk. She said there had been a night guard before me who requested a transfer after 3 weeks, and that was all she knew, and she said it looking down at her desk. I checked the county employee directory that afternoon. Suite 304 has been unassigned since 2019. Our next story. Halfway down Quarter Street, I noticed the church marquee still lit, which was strange because Pastor Rull turned it off every night at 9, and I had never once seen it on past closing. My shift at the diner ended at 11, so I marked it as nothing, just a timer gone wrong, and kept walking. The sign read, "We remember April 14th, the same way it had for the 3 years I had been at Alderman College. Every student learned to stop asking about April 14th. The locals would go quiet and find something else to look at, or they would say it was a fundraiser, a memorial, something they said in a way that closed the door. I walked past the hardware store, past the barber, past the empty lot where something used to be. There was a woman standing at the far end of the lot facing the fence. She was not doing anything, just standing with her hands at her sides. I told myself she lived nearby and had stepped out for air, which people do, and I kept my pace. But I had taken maybe 20 steps when I heard her say my name, not loudly, the way you say a name when you are reading it off a list. I turned around. She had not moved. She was still facing the fence. I walked the rest of the way home in the middle of the road because the streetlights reached there and nowhere else. I told my roommate about it over the sink and she went very still. She asked me which lot. I described the block and she dried her hands slowly and said that was where the school used to be before April 14th. She never told me what happened on April 14th, but she started locking the door after that. Our next story. Gravel crunched under my boots as I stepped away from the rig to stretch, and that is when I noticed the other truck had not moved in the 3 hours since I pulled in. Same spot, same angle, engine cold, no lights, a Peterbilt with Kansas plates and a load of what looked like covered lumber. I did not think much of it at first. Drivers sleep long when they need to. I went inside for coffee. The woman behind the counter was maybe 60, hair pinned tight, a name tag that said Doris. I mentioned the truck the way you do, just making conversation. She set my cup down without looking up and said there was no truck out there. I took my coffee to the window. The Peterbilt was 10 feet from the glass. She had already turned her back to me. I asked the man filling up by pump 2, a local by the look of his plates. He glanced at the truck, then at me, and shook his head once the way you shake your head at a stray dog you have learned not to feed. Around 3 in the morning, I walked the lot again because I could not sleep. I shone my flashlight through the Peterbilt door window. The cab was clean, no personal items, no logbook, no coffee cup, nothing that said a human being had ever sat there. But the sleeper curtain behind the seat was drawn shut, and on the inside of the glass, pressed flat, were 4 fingers and a thumb. Low down, like whoever left them had been reaching up from the floor. By sunrise, the truck was gone, and Doris poured my coffee like she had never seen me before in her life. Our next story. Pulling nails out of the old subfloor, I found the photograph. It was face down under a piece of warped pine near the back bedroom door, dry and brittle but intact. A family stood in front of the farmhouse, my farmhouse, and the date stamped on the white border read 1971. Normal enough, I set it on the windowsill and kept working. 2 days later, I drove into town for more sandpaper and mentioned it at the hardware store, the kind of small place where the owner also runs the register. I described the photo, said it was nice to have a piece of the house's history. The man behind the counter handed me my change and looked just past my shoulder. He said he didn't know anything about the previous owners. The woman browsing the paint chips at the end of the aisle picked up her purse and left without buying anything. I asked around a little after that. The woman at the post office said the property had been vacant a long time. The man at the diner refilled my coffee and told me the roads out that way flood every spring, like I had asked about the roads. Nobody said a name. I noticed that. Last week I was pulling up the rest of the subfloor in that back bedroom and found a second photograph. Same family, same pose, same front porch. The stamp on this one read 1974. They looked exactly the same as before, same clothing, same positions, same faces, except there was a window in the background of this one that hadn't been in the first, and through it, just barely visible in the interior dark, something was standing behind the glass. The house had no second floor in 1974. Our next story. A man walked in at midnight and asked for a room under the name Aldous Fell. I wrote it down without thinking, ran his card, handed him the key to 14. He thanked me quietly and walked the long way around the parking lot instead of cutting straight across to his door. I watched him on the camera. He stopped at the edge of the lot where the asphalt ends and the scrub grass starts and stood there for maybe 2 minutes before going inside. Around 2 in the morning, I flipped through the old ledger we keep behind the desk, the paper one from before the software, just something to do. Aldous Fell was in there. Same handwriting as mine, same room number, but the date was from 11 years ago. I told myself it was a common enough name. I told myself the previous clerk must have had similar handwriting. I got up and poured bad coffee and stood at the window. His light was on. That was fine. Then it went off. That was fine too. Then I heard the side door, the one that only opens from inside, click shut. I checked the camera and the parking lot was empty. His car, a tan sedan I had barely noticed, was gone. I had not heard an engine. I went to 14 in the morning to turn it over before the day girl came in. The bed was made, not slept in and remade, but made the way housekeeping leaves it, with the fold and the little paper strip across the pillow. The key was on the desk. When I mentioned Aldous Fell to the day girl, she looked at the counter and said she had to check something in the back. She never came back out. Our next story. Box 14 on my route was always the last stop, a rural mailbox at the end of a gravel spur off County Road 9, and whoever lived there ordered a lot of packages. I never thought much about it. The job is the job. That Tuesday I pulled up around 11:30 and got out with a flat parcel under my arm. The house sat maybe 200 feet back from the road, no lights on, which was normal. What stopped me was the other van parked at the end of the spur. White, no markings, engine off. I figured a neighbor, maybe another carrier running late, and I set the package in the box and turned back. The white van was gone. I had been at that mailbox maybe 40 seconds. I mentioned it to the woman who ran the gas station in Delaware the next morning when I stopped for coffee. I described the road, the box number, the van. She poured my cup and said nothing for a moment. Then she said she did not know that road well. She had lived in Delaware her whole life. I let it sit for a week. Then I looked up the property tax records online, which is public information. Box 14's address returned a parcel listed as agricultural land, no structure, no registered owner since 2009. I drove out there in the daylight on my day off. The gravel spur was real. The mailbox was real. I could see my own boot prints in the soft dirt from the week before. There were other prints too, older ones, from what looked like a lot of people walking in a single line toward the tree line, and not one set walking back. I put in for a new route the next morning. Our next story. Chalk dust from room 4 settled on my sleeve when I pushed the door open, same as every Thursday. I wiped it off, propped my cart against the wall, and started on the boards. 20 minutes in, I noticed the attendance sheet still pinned to the corkboard, which was nothing unusual, except that one name near the bottom had been circled in red pen. Just one, Denny Marsh. I did not think much of it. Teachers circle things. I moved on to the hallway, running the buffer down toward the gymnasium, and that is when I noticed the trophy case. The glass on the front panel had been wiped clean from the inside. I could see the streak marks going outward, fingers pressing from the interior of the case. I stood there for a second and told myself the custodian on the morning shift had rearranged something in there and reached in from the back panel. That made sense. I kept going. The gym lights were already on when I got there, which they should not have been. In the center of the floor, directly under the main fixture, someone had set out a single student desk. On top of it was a class photo, facing up. I walked over and looked at it. Every face had been crossed out with the same red pen, every face except one boy standing in the back row. The date printed along the bottom edge read 1981. I asked the principal about it the next morning, keeping it casual, saying I found something left out in the gym. She looked at me for a long moment, then looked away. She told me Denny Marsh had never been a student here, and that I should not worry about the gym. She knew the name before I said it. Our next story. The younger one called out for water around 9, and by the time I got her settled, it was nearly 10 and the house had gone quiet. I did what I always do, checked all the locks, turned on the small lamp in the hallway, and sat down at the kitchen table with my phone. Normal night in Delaware, which meant nothing moved and nothing made noise, and the road outside stayed empty. I noticed the photographs on the refrigerator around 10:30. There were 4 of them, held up with plain magnets, the kind of school pictures every family has. 2 kids I recognized from the bedrooms upstairs. 2 kids I did not, a boy and a girl, maybe 8 and 10, with the same pale coloring as the children I was watching. I figured cousins, maybe. I did not think much of it. Then I saw the names written on the back of one when it slipped and fell to the floor. Tyler and me, same last name as the family, same last name as the 2 sleeping upstairs. I asked about it the next morning when the parents got home, as casual as I could manage. The mother just took the picture from my hand and stuck it back on the refrigerator without looking at it. The father poured his coffee and said something about the girls sleeping fine, changing the subject so smoothly I almost let it go. I did not let it go. I asked a woman at the diner about the family a few days later. She set down the coffee pot and looked at me the way people here look at anyone who asks the wrong question. She said that family has had 4 children for as long as anyone can remember. Our next story. On the second day of the storm, I found a name carved into the baseboard behind the radiator. Not scratched the way a bored child marks height on a doorframe, but carved with patience, each letter clean. Delia Voss, and below it a year, 1962. I was renting the house furnished and short-term, so I did not think much of it. Old houses carry old names. The third day I had no power for 6 hours, and I spent most of it reading on the couch with a flashlight. When the lights came back, I noticed the photo on the mantel, one of those sepia portraits the landlord must have left for atmosphere. A woman standing in front of what looked like the same house. I had walked past that photo a dozen times, but that evening I looked at it long enough to see the name written in pencil on the back of the frame. Delia Voss. That was a coincidence, and I told myself so. I texted the landlord to ask about the history of the place. He replied fast, faster than anyone replies at 11 at night during a blizzard. Just an old rental, he said. Nobody interesting ever lived there. I called the one diner that had answered calls all week because I had nothing else to do and I was going a little restless. I mentioned the name to the woman who picked up, just making conversation. She went quiet for a few seconds and then said the roads would probably clear by Friday and that I should sit tight. She did not ask how I had heard that name. I had not told her I heard it anywhere.